Big Law as an institution comprises more than 120,000 lawyers. It also generates billions of dollars in revenue every year. Policies at some of these big law firms are written very ambiguously. But I do think that there are reasons people choose to go into big law, and it's hard to fault them for that.
Ryan Powers, a Harvard law grad, licensed in New York and DC. His story is one that I think needs to be told. It's critical that we elevate the voices of those who are speaking up. This op-ed that you wrote leads with this sentence: big law, it turns out, doesn't just train lawyers, it also trains silence. What do you mean by that?
If your employer fundamentally has a lot of power, particularly in the legal profession, then they have a lot of reach to change things, a lot of room to not change things. And depending on the choices of your employer, your speech itself can be directly under threat.
Ryan, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
You know, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, but unfortunately, this is the world that we live in. And so before we get too much further, I'd love for you to just share with our listeners a little bit about you, why you went to law school, what it was like at Harvard in this climate, and how we got to this point where you're trying to fight back against this Trump regime.
Absolutely. So I'm from Philadelphia originally. I have known for a very long time that I wanted to go to law school because I am also a high school dropout. So it was very important for me to look at the systems that created that and the circumstances that I thought could be fixed or maybe changed to improve the lives of people who were in similar situations to me. So I ended up going to law school. I was motivated to not only get really great professional training, but also do the right thing, earn some savings, be able to have a career that I was really proud of. So I ended up enrolling at Harvard. At Harvard, I was fortunate that I was only there really during the time that our former president was in office. And so we weren't really affected as much by the current presidential regime. But I think definitely when you were at Harvard, you had a sense that things you did mattered and carried some consequence based on the way that people perceived Harvard in the world. So I took that responsibility really seriously. And it really led me to make many decisions, both in law school and up to our present conversation, that I like to think reflect those values.
You write that this op-ed that you wrote that I recommend everyone read leads with this sentence: big law, it turns out, doesn't just train lawyers, it also trains silence. What do you mean by that?
I mean that big law as an institution comprises more than 120,000 lawyers. It also generates billions of dollars in revenue every year. And because of that, there's a prioritization of the status quo. So people are very afraid to create waves. They're very afraid to create any sort of discontent out of fear that perhaps there could be retaliation or some sort of public reckoning. And I think where that's a problem in our current regime is when the law itself is under attack through a president who's stripping security clearances, issuing executive orders targeting law firms, and targeting independent bar associations. That means something. So when there's a culture of silence and suppression going on because people cannot speak freely about these issues, there are real consequences.
Shakespeare famously wrote that we're going to create chaos, and the first thing we'll do is we'll kill all the lawyers. And people often misattribute that to mean that he was anti-lawyer. And the statement actually is the opposite. He's actually very pro-lawyer because he's pointing out that it is lawyers who are kind of the last line of defense for the ordinary person. People think it's judges, but you still need a lawyer to go before the judge to argue the case, to protect those rights. And we're seeing this capitulation. And, you know, part of the frustration for me is how this is not just an issue of the right, it's an issue of the left. Doug Emhoff gave a resounding lecture about the importance of lawyers and standing up against this regime. And the very next day, his firm signed an MOU with the Trump regime to represent them and give them pro bono legal hours while he's a partner at the firm. And I think it's important that we call that out, not because I'm anti-Doug. I've met him, I think he's a nice guy. But at the same time, if you're going to talk the talk, you better be willing to walk the walk because you come from a place of privilege and power, and these injustices that we're seeing aren't going to affect you the same way that they affect everyone else. You've written this op-ed, it's gone viral, and you know, one of the things that you'll never be able to get back is this experience of trying to protect your legal career. This is going to follow you. And I don't say that as a knock. I say that actually as a commendation that history will record that when push came to shove, you refused to back down from your principles. And I think, it's difficult now in the long term. It's going to pay off. I know it will. History, the moral arc of the universe always bends towards justice. But talk, Ryan, a little bit about what kind of impact this is having on you financially, on your mental health, on your future prospects.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's not something that people have really asked about yet. I think that it was a hard decision to make. Ultimately, I knew that the stakes were very high. This is my career that we're talking about. It wasn't just getting fired, because I could have very quietly gone on to my next opportunity without creating any sort of conversation. But I really wanted to. And so when I decided that it was something that people should hear, should discuss, particularly this idea that policies at some of these big law firms are written very ambiguously, very deliberately. And I think because of that, there are consequences for lawyers they should be aware of, and there are consequences that spill out into the broader public. And so it's been challenging. The fallout has been really me losing my job, losing my salary, my health insurance. I still have a place to live, which is great. And I've gotten a lot of really effusive support over the past few days and some thoughtful criticism as well, which I think only moves the narrative forward. But it's not been something that's easy, and it's not been something that I did without thinking. There was a lot of sacrifice involved, but I'm happy I did it, and I feel very confident in my decision.
And you should, because at the end of the day, we often talk about moments in history of what would I have done in this moment in history. And if I was there, I would have, stood with the good guys, or I would have marched across that Edmund Pettus Bridge, or I would have, stood with Rosa Parks, or I would have, stood with Robert Smalls and Fred Hampton and all these icons of history. We forget that we're making history every day, and every day we have the opportunity to make a choice on how we want to proceed. You wrote a follow-up op-ed, Ryan, about what you would have done differently, or what you wish you would have done differently. And I want to walk through that because I think this is also indicative of your character and your integrity. The first thing you said you wish you had done differently is that you wish you had done this sooner. Talk about why, and talk about the process of what made you finally pull the trigger to say, I need to speak out now.
Right. So I wish I had done it sooner because everything went down about 6 weeks ago now, and it took me a good amount of time to write the piece, to edit it. I was initially shopping it to different publications and having conversations about that. Um, but it needed to come out. And I think every day that you wait is another day that this keeps going on without any sort of conversation. So yeah, I wish I had done it sooner.
One of the things that folks often forget is, um, and this is kind of your second point of how lonely the process is. And what folks often forget is that it doesn't have to be lonely because I think we all agree we don't want the suppression of speech, of legitimate differences of opinions. You're not advocating violence. You're not advocating anarchy or chaos. You're expressing a different perspective where we should uphold the rule of law. We should uphold a sense of justice. And oftentimes it's lonely because only a few folks are willing to speak up. So what's your message, Ryan, to those who see the problem, who see what's happening, but are afraid to speak up for obvious reasons, retaliation, loss of income, loss of their living status? What is the message to them to make them feel more confident and comfortable in speaking up?
The message is that you're going to be okay. Because when I had gone through this process, a real guiding light for me was Rachel Cohen, who was the attorney who was fired. Well, she quit from her big law firm after anticipating that they would crack a deal with the president in a way that she felt she could not morally support as an employee. And
Yeah.
watching Rachel's journey and the ways in which she navigated the system, I thought, okay, life will not end if things at big in my big law firm don't work out don't work out, excuse me. And fundamentally, I felt very confident about talking to people about this and getting the message out there and creating conversation.
You make a point as well that your critique of in terms of things that you had wish you had done differently, that you wish you had been more specific, and you really provide a thoughtful nuance here, Ryan. And I'm going to quote you here. You say, and more importantly, my piece is a critique of firm leadership exclusively. I had hoped this was clear, but many of my friends work in big law. I have immense respect and admiration for the current I'm sorry, for the current big law attorneys and alumni quietly working within these systems to enact change. I commend them. At my former firm, I harbor nothing but utmost admiration for the vast majority of people who work there. So let's talk about that because some would argue and some do argue that it's not just the leadership that needs critique, it's the entire industry that needs critique. And if you're participating in it, you're complicit with it. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that argument, but it is an argument put forth that we can't just be critical of the leadership because the leadership wouldn't have anyone to lead if the rest of the organization would stand up and say, no, we're not going to tolerate this. Why is your critique exclusively of firm leadership and not the broader big law industry?
This is why I think it's a great question. And this is why I think having nuanced conversations about people who may feel differently is really important.
Yeah.
I think that at the end of the day, there are a lot of people who do these jobs because they realize it could help them with their career, or in some ways could be a financial lifeline for someone to support their family, to pay off student loans, and to help them live. And I can't fault someone for making individual choices like that. I can understand that there are other jobs, there are other professional pathways that one could take as a lawyer, particularly if you're coming from elite education, like a law degree. But I do think that there are reasons, as I write about in my op-ed, that people choose to go into big law, and it's hard to fault them for that.
I think it's a fair point. Look, at the end of the day, everyone's at their own particular journey. Everyone has obligations, and I would rather use honey than vinegar to draw people out and say, hey, we can find ways to work together. Not everyone is going to have the courage that you're showing, Ryan, but everyone can do something. And as long as we're moving the ball forward, I think that's the important point about this. We certainly aren't going to, the old adage is that the beatings will continue until morale improves. Like that doesn't work and we need to find better ways to have these conversations. And finally, you point out something that I thought was very beautifully said, that I wish I had been angrier. James Baldwin reminds us that, well, regarding racial injustice, he says that to be black and to be consciously aware is to be in a state of anger or rage all the time. And that's the vibe I got from what you said here. But talk a bit more about that. Why do you wish you were angrier? What do you wish you were more angry about? What does that look like?
I think the legal profession really prioritizes people who are quiet and composed and articulate everything with utmost precision and calmness and clarity. And I think there are a lot of strengths there. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I also think it's something that we should think about when our institutions themselves are under attack. I think it's really important to meet the moment the way that it needs to be met. And I'm not advocating for any sort of violence. I'm not advocating for an overthrow of these institutions, but I am arguing for really strong, really bold change. And I think that means speaking out. I think that means questioning policies, thinking about why we follow things that we follow. And it's something that we need to really, really do with utmost vigor and the most passion right now to meet the moment. Because if we don't, the forces that are much stronger than us will capitalize off of our silence and they will use that as justification. And we cannot have that.
And we see it is really beautifully said, Ryan. And I think we see uh, that anger manifest in different industries in different ways. In the healthcare industry, we see the anger of Luigi Mangione, certainly not defending what he did and certainly not endorsing it at all. I will say that we need to be honest about violence. Um, it is violence to kill a CEO in broad daylight. And it is violence for a CEO to enact policy that he knows will kill tens of thousands of people. The fact that our society or our legal system condemns only one kind of violence and not the other kind is, I think, fundamentally a problem. If it is wrong to kill a CEO in broad daylight, and I agree it is absolutely wrong, it is also wrong to pass policies that denying that child insulin is going to kill that child, denying that person AIDS medication is going to kill that person, and to do it knowingly. As a statistic, suddenly, well, I'm increasing shareholder value. Well, that's fundamentally a problem, and it elicits a violent response as well. And as we know, violence begets violence. In the legal profession, I think we're seeing some of the same things. Right now, we're seeing the power of the attorney general, the power of the president to flat out hide something like the Epstein files and pretend that they simply don't exist. He ran on this platform. Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in prison for trafficking young children, young girls in particular. But suddenly, it no longer exists. And that to me is a violation of basic legal ethics. Pam Bondi fired her ethics lawyer for God's sake. That's not something you do when you're maintaining ethical compliance. That's something you do when you're about to break the law severely. And I think the point is that if you or I were to do something like that as ordinary attorneys, we would rightfully be disbarred immediately. But those in power doing something like this, they're celebrated, they're praised, and they're given even more power. So I think with that, kind of a soapbox, the question that I want to formulate, Ryan, is how do you maintain a sense of optimism that up against such powerful odds, against such powerful people and institutions, um, you as the individual or we as individuals can make any kind of meaningful change and progress?
It's really the power of storytelling and narratives because the amount of people who have responded to me and told me, hey, I feel this. I feel that Big Law has been really, really complicit and it's hard to work in and it's hard to see happening and they don't know what to do. And there are also a lot of people who have reached out from other industries and said, this was a problem for me 2 years ago. This was a problem for me last year. This is a problem that everybody is facing to some extent. If your employer fundamentally has a lot of power, particularly in the legal profession, then they have a lot of reach to change things. And they also have a lot of speech to not, or sorry, a lot of room to not change things. And depending on the choices of your employer, your speech itself can be directly under threat. So the more people that are talking about this and sharing their stories and really coming forth about, hey, this is a real problem, let's talk about it, it gives me a lot of hope.
And it's that collective action that's going to bring about meaningful change. That's how it's always been. Whether it's the Montgomery bus boycott, whether it's Robert Smalls convincing Lincoln to allow Black people to enlist in the Union Army to fight back against the white supremacist South during the Civil War, whether it's Irene Morgan and Claudette Colvin as the precursors to Rosa Parks. It is those individual acts of courage that rise up. And I think I neglected to mention this earlier, but the piece that kind of was the straw that broke the law firm's back was about surveillance, was about federal surveillance. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think listeners need to know that you aren't just, sharing an opinion that was by any means controversial. I think you were sharing an opinion that whether you're Republican or Democrat, liberal, conservative, far right, far left, you will agree we don't want more government surveillance over our private lives. To talk a little bit about the piece that finally kind of led to the situation that you're in right now.
Right. So I'll start bigger and then go smaller. Is none of the pieces that I wrote had any political opinion infused at all. They were all meant to be very nonpartisan and give people the information they needed to make informed decisions about what was going on in their lives, particularly non-lawyers. I thought it was a good thing to do. I kept doing it. And the latest article was about Palantir and the federal government having the ability to collaborate together as they have done in the past. There is precedent with ICE and Palantir to essentially mine individuals' personal data, profile them, and store and use it unbeknownst to them in any way that they choose to. And I think that's something that every American should be concerned about. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that we do not talk enough about. And Palantir is an extremely powerful organization and something we should be clearly discussing in public and loudly.
Ryan, your courage is inspiring, it's powerful. How can folks listening to this or watching this follow you and support you and your work and your advocacy?
Thank you. I'm at Ryan Will Powers on all socials. On my Substack, I'll continue to write about the rule of law and what we can do to defend it.
Ryan Powers, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.